this is just going to be a little informal breakdown on Rhei'a's World Cleaver ability. It's this kind of multi-part ability where she slams her hammer down, her axe down, sorry. She does this rolling shockwave that kind of like pops out the ground and slams a bunch of dirt up above her. And what I want to talk about for it is the method I used to make it, because I think it was pretty efficient, to be honest. I needed to make 3 different textures that were all kind of similar, of 3 different meshes where you had these shockwaves coming from the center, a triangular one, a semicircle, and then a whole circle. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with the effect, and something I wanted to do was like match up the shapes in the mesh to the shapes of the decal that I put on the floor, so it looks like the front of the mesh is sort of exploding out, and then it burns this pattern into the floor behind it. And you can see like here, for example, you know, these 2 shapes, that's actually lined up with these shapes on the floor. So you see this sort of zigzag. So making efficient use of textures in multiple ways in this asset, and getting that behavior of like, you know, shards of rock rolling up. So, and also doing this purely with world position offsets. So we don't want to, you know, animate these. We don't want to manually model each of these rock shards, because that would take absolutely forever. And we don't want to animate them because, you know, having a skinned mesh with like 500 bones doing this little thing is, well, it's going to be laborious to set up, and it's also going to be pretty expensive. So I'm going to talk about the way I did it. So the first step was coming in Substance and generating some cells. These are, you know, these shapes here that each line up to each other and kind of make this sort of rocky shape. Now, the thing that I didn't like about this was that they're all very consistent. And if I were doing, you know, some nice shape design by hand, I would have big, medium, and small pieces near each other in a way that is like visually appealing. And because these are sort of programmatic, it doesn't always deliver on that shape. So the way we solve that is we have 2 different sizes of cells, and then we're blending them together by selecting some of the larger cells and making those be a mask that masks out some smaller cells. So we have some big and some small. And that's, you know, the kind of core of this technique. We're using an edge detect node here to detect the edges of these rock chunks. The next thing we're doing, and pardon this because this should be up here, is we're beveling the edge. So we're beveling the edge to give this, like the inside of the rock faces. If you see what I mean here, you know, we need to have, the rocks shouldn't just be completely flat. We want them to have this little angle to them. So that when they come up, they have a little bit of a gap between them, and we can kind of show the lava between it. So we have a bevel, but when you just have one bevel, it's very boring. If every single cell has the same amount of bevel, it looks a little bit too regular. Excuse me while it's frozen. So what we don't want is for all of these pieces to have the exact same bevel. It's very boring and it looks too regular. So we have 2 different sizes of bevels. This one's much smaller, and then this one's much larger. And then we're blending between them using a Voronoi noise. So you see how like here the edge is very sharp, and over here the chunk edge is very wide. So that gives us a really nice texture. Now we basically invert that to get the parts that we want to make it glow, and we can output this to Unreal. this. I think I use this later on. We can also take the levels, gradient map this kind of gradient onto here, and this will actually give us the top edges of the chunks. So this is like this edge here. You see how it's sort of a bit brighter. We've used this mask here to make that edge more obvious. And then we need to like blur them and blend them and do stuff to them to make them be good again. You don't want them super regular, so we're just sort of messing it up. And we end up with this sort of texture here, which gives us that sort of edge highlight. Yeah, and you can see what this is going to look like were we to use a normal. We're not using a normal because we're actually exporting this as a displacement map into Maya. So this is what it would look like if we put this texture straight into a game, which is pretty cool. You know, you could have made a cracked texture like this. But this doesn't actually give us the individual pieces. So to do that, we need to take this one, or maybe it was this one, and then we're going to put that into Maya. Now, I'm not going to show you this whole thing, but here is a video in Maya on how to basically take a plane, put a texture on it, and then use that texture as a displacement map, which will, you know, make it
some changes
out
on the side.
So if you rendered this in Maya, you'd see this displacement.
So
but what we actually do is we
them.
bake that down into the polygons. So we've actually physically got the mesh here. That gives us something like, I guess this. This is a very high poly texture, high poly model, right? Now, the next step to do is to bake this map into the vertex colors of the mesh so that you can select, using a script, all of the polygons that are basically in the gap, right? We don't want any polygons in this gap here. So we can bake the white texture down into it, and then we can delete the white texture, and that will give us, you know, individual chunks where I could select this one chunk, and you can see my computer is very much struggling with running 12 programs at once. You can see how we can move that chunk up and down, right? Again, very high poly mesh, 900,000 polygons, maybe fine for nanite, not good for standard game dev. So what we want to do next is we simplify this mesh. Where is my simplified mesh? I don't think that is it, but you can poly reduce it. I just poly reduced it right down. Here is the final model that we put into game. This is, I mean, it's still relatively expensive at 52,000 polygons, but this includes the next step as well, which is that you take this whole mesh, you select all of the edge polygons, and you just extrude it down. So we're going to have these nice tall pieces. And if I select one of these pieces, you know, I can slide it up and down, and you're going to see the effect that's going on. Now, you might have noticed that they're all different colors, and it looks very colorful. I'll explain why that is. So if we go into Unreal, and the method that we're going to do is to use world position offset. Now, world position offset just takes the vertices of the mesh and offsets them in a specific direction. In this case, I'm telling it, I want you to offset them in the blue channel, or the Z, which is in Unreal, the up and down. And we're just putting the shockwave. Now, you might notice that this doesn't look correct, right? The reason being that if we just offset a shockwave through a mesh like this, and here I'll show you what the preview of that shockwave looks like, it's going to smoothly interpolate each vertices based on its position. So that's why you get this sort of nice round smooth thing, and that's not what we want. What we want is that if we're ever moving one piece of rock we want to move the entire piece of rock and none of the vertices on any neighboring piece of rock unless we reach that point. So that is why this looks so colorful in here. What we've basically done is Omar Garcia, our tech artist, helped me make a script that says basically, since these can all be separate objects, we just separated them to different objects. We told Maya, hey, where is this object? If I make a grid here where this is 0 and this is 1, or I guess this is 0 and this is 1 along the x, and this is 0 and this is 1 along the y, what is my world position relative to this grid? And so here it would be like 0.25, and here on the y it'd be like 0.1, and then we paint that color onto this entire object, so it becomes, you know, dark red and only a little bit of green. Down here they're fully green, over here they're fully red, and over here they're fully yellow. Then we merge this back into one object, so that, you know, you can export it to Unreal as one thing. And then in Unreal, so previously I was just saying, hey, take the texture coordinate of this thing mapped from the top down. Instead of that, I'm taking the vertex color and I'm putting it into a bunch of math here that basically says, hey, offset it so that the center of the object is the center of this thing. Use that as a sign to make it sort of repeat circularly. And then we're adding a value from our time onto this, and we're signing that value, which gives us, I know this sounds very complicated, but it gives us this wave that heads out in both directions, right? That's what signing each of these axes does. It makes a shockwave starting at the center and heading out to the side. So we're basically using these colors as the time in the sine wave that we're gonna go and do stuff. I'm clamping it. How big you make the period of this sine wave as well determines like how much of the mesh will move at once. So if you make it 1, you're gonna get like the whole mesh moving at once, right? If you make it like 0.1, you're gonna get just a very thin slice of the mesh moving at once. I found for my particular setup, like 0.2 was about right. I got this feeling of like seeing the things rise up one after another. And then we just output these other textures that we made in Substance to create the rest of the material, to give us this orange color on the sides, to sort of fade up to where the top is. We have these black chunks. So I'm using this one in the end, which we looked at earlier. And I lost this one to just highlight the edges of the chunks and make them shiny on the edge. And yeah, that's basically the technique. So what is cool about this is, like I said, this is all done through the world position offset. Here I just have it hooked up to a debug, but really you drive it through this dynamic parameter here, which we plug into our particle system. We put a little flipbook in there. Niles made that one, which is really nice. And then the other cool thing is, like I said, all the techniques that you use to create this mesh, you can also use to create like a decal on the floor. So if you look at like this here, right, you see how these 3 chunks are unique and they sort of match there. You can use this to create your decal on the ground. One moment. Okay, so you see how we can put onto the floor, one of these, this decal. And that allows us to have the mesh almost look like it's sort of exploding directly out of these spaces. Yeah, and I'm pretty pleased with the overall effect that goes on there. So once again, just show you like it stands out, and we can see these exact shapes sort of meld into the ground and leave this burnt sort of texture behind. Yeah, there are 3 different meshes. I probably could have optimized it by just having one mesh and then masking out the specific chunks that fell to value, but pretty time limited on this. So yeah, and then the other thing that I did using this almost exactly the same technique was when you grab something with the alt, we've just made a sphere that uses very similar techniques. It sort of rolls backwards. So if you move left, the sphere will roll right, giving this impression that like these chunks are the Earth being sort of disturbed up. And yeah, so like you could do this. That was a bit of a pain because we had to map it onto a sphere, and then I had to hand stitch the edges together where the texture didn't quite line up. But other than a kind of couple hours staring into Maya, that was generally fine. We ended up with this sort of result here. Here we go. And this ball is this one just has random colors instead of this precise recent files crack ball. This one just has random colors so that when we put that into the offset time, it'll just randomly jiggle different ones. And then if you look at each individual shard, we basically smush them down and use a script to like suck them down to a little center so that they would look like the ground, but let there be little cracks so you can see in between and see the glow underneath. And then that again is just in the blueprint, we added a component to the character, which is this ball, and when you move left, it rolls right, and when you move right, it rolls left. So yeah, I would say that, you know, I think that this technique is very useful for very quickly making a cool effect that it's quite a convincing sort of rolling, smashy, meshy thing. Yeah. And I hope this has been useful. Bye.